welcome. Thank you all for coming to afternoon session, which is discussing. There'll be two discussions today, sessions on the problems of modern day society. I suppose most people here who've come today will realise, before, there's a lot wrong with today's society, that, especially in the last 2-3 years of the economic crisis. Even in the mainstream press, they say there's something wrong. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and social problems multiply, and you have problems like the possible collapse of the Eurozone, which may impact even further, create a bigger crisis, intensify the crisis at an even higher level. What we've done is we've organised today two meetings, not really debates, more discussions between two groups who are concerned by these problems and seek a solution, how to overcome it. First morning session beginning now will be analysis of today's society, the problems of today's society. Tell us what's wrong with the present economic system. Speaker, first of all, will be Dick Fields on my left here. He's representing the Socialist Party of Great Britain, which is part of the World Socialist Movement. On my right, you have, he's not here yet, actually. Sorry, Francesco, he'll be turning up. He's a bit late this morning. He'll be speaking on behalf of the Zeitgeist Movement. But he's a bit late. But we'll start out. Dick will start first, and Francesco hopefully will come in and take his place. If not, Steve Duffield will speak on his behalf if he fails to turn up. Okay, and the afternoon session is the solution, what we think is a solution to the problems. And the speaker will be Steve Duffield here. He's not speaking this morning. And Adam Buick on behalf of the World Socialist Movement. Okay, and well, the format of the discussion, both discussions will be that each speaker will talk about 20 minutes, and then the floor will be open up to discussion for any questions and contributions from the floor.
Well, hello. It's nice to see many people here, especially these days when public debate on social issues is very much a kind of minority interest. I'm very conscious that some of you here may not know anything about the Socialist Party of Great Britain. So just before I really get into the talk, I just want very, very briefly to introduce us to you. We were founded in 1904, which is significant because it means that we actually came into being before the development of the Labour movement, the Labour Party, and also before the Russian Revolution. So our understanding of socialism and capitalism belongs really to, or is similar to, very much what most people thought of socialism before those events. So I would just ask you before I begin, not to make too many assumptions about what we stand for, because we don't necessarily follow the kind of common conception of socialism that you might actually be more familiar with. It's kind of an unusual experience for a socialist to be standing with another organisation that shares actually a very great deal of assumptions about the world in which we live, that has very similar criticisms of capitalism and has a conception of a post-capitalist society that in many ways is similar to our own. If you look at the websites of the two organisations, you'll see this. We do differ, of course. We differ, I think, principally on 3 issues, in my understanding. Francesca, sorry.
What is it?
Yeah. Yes. So, Steve, you by all means correct me if I misunderstood this. But the 3 areas that I see where we differ is that we differ in the underlying causes of the problems which capitalism throws up. We differ to some extent on how we get there, and we also differ on the administrative needs of the post-capitalist society. Those differences, I think, will become clear in the course of the afternoon. I don't intend to dwell upon them. I'm hoping that we can open this to a kind of free and frank discussion. both organisations take the view that the way forward is through open, frank discussion. So, my task then now is to put the case against capitalism from a specifically social point of view. So, what's wrong with capitalism? Well, what would your list be? This is something that I came up with earlier, put together in no particular order. Criticism of capitalism, poverty among plenty, hunger and starvation, large-scale hunger and starvation in large sections of the world, economic famine, economic insecurity, destitution, debt slavery in certain parts of the world, especially in India, preventable disease, such business practices as programmed obsolescence, the production of shoddy goods to reduce prices, the boom-bust economy, the waste of human labour and energy on activities which are of dubious use to society, environmental pollution, the seeming ability of our statesmen to be able to come up with a workable solution to problems which are of considerable human significance, such as global warming, political oppression, discrimination of all kinds, racism, the oppression and exploitation of women, the drudgery of daily life in the workplace for many, many people, the lack of opportunities to develop our full potential, crime, social conflict, a whole host of things that we could actually aim at the world in which we live to say these things are not right, these things need to be put right. You can probably add to this yourself. Now, in 20 minutes, as socialists, we lay most of these things at the feet of the capitalist system itself. Some things are some of these issues are the direct cause, directly caused by capitalism. Some are more indirectly caused by capitalism. But we would actually argue that most of these things are a result of the basic defining function of capitalism itself, the basic finding of relationship on which capitalism is actually built. Now, in 20 minutes, I'm not going to be able to cover all of these, and I'm going to be giving you quite a sketchy view of our view on all these things, and of course, I won't be able to deal with all of them. But what I would say to you is that the cause of all these things goes back to what I've said before. It's the fundamental defining characteristic of capitalism. So if you understand the cause of one, you're well on the way to understanding the cause of all of them. Now, in order to explain how we believe capitalism is at the root of all these problems, you first of all have to understand what capitalism is. Now, capitalism is not a political system. Okay? It's an economic system. Capitalism, as an economic system, can exist under many different types of regimes, whether it's the kind of representative democracy, which we're familiar with in the UK, whether it's an absolute monarchy, whether it's under a civil or military dictatorship. Capitalism can function under all these political systems. And just as it's not a political system, it is not another term for the free market. Now, this has become very, very popular definition in recent years, especially among the right, the American right in particular, among so-called libertarians and anarcho-capitalists. But it's not. It's more fundamental than that. The market is a system for distributing goods. But before you distribute goods, you have to produce them. Okay? And that is the fundamental task of all societies, all and every. All kinds of human economic organisation is the production of goods. And in the historical period at least, this has always been done socially. It's always been done by people acting together. I mean, that's particularly true in capitalism. If you think about a cup of coffee you might have had this morning, if you really think about it, you'll realise that it actually took the labour of thousands, possibly millions of people to get that cup of coffee onto your table. So we produce things in a very, very social way. And when we produce things socially, we have to enter into certain kinds of relationships with one another. And the defining characteristic of a particular kind of economy is the kind of relationships that people enter into in order to produce. Now, in capitalism, the relations that we actually enter into are very straightforward. There are two, broadly speaking, groups of people. There are those whose function within society is to accumulate capital. Sorry, can we come in?
Thank you. Apologies.
I think I recognise you're Francesco.
Yes,
okay.
Apologies for being late. Tomas.
That's lovely.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, there are two groups of people within capitalist society. Those who accumulate capital, that's their function, and those that they employ for the purpose of accumulating capital. That's most of us, that's probably most of us actually here in this room, if not all of us. People who sell their labour to an employer because their labour is the only marketable thing they actually possess. I brought with me two items to kind of illustrate this. I brought with me, first of all, my payslip. Okay. Now, this is probably very much like your payslip. It's probably a computer if you're in work. It's a computerized item, and it comes with these really ridiculous tear-off bits that never seem to work and always tear up and everything. That's the payslip. That represents one side of the capitalist equation, the working class, those who actually sell their labour for a living. Now, it's very notable that on most payslips that I've seen, it doesn't actually say how much in the course of the month, how much wealth you've created for the organisation. It just says how many hours that it's paying you for. I'll come back to that. Having looked at the wage slip, on the other side, there is accumulation of capital, which we might call profit. So the other thing that I've actually brought, well, I didn't actually. I do have a copy of my employer's profit and loss account for last year. But I almost brought it along, but I thought as you're filming it, you may not be too happy to actually see it in a sort of big wave around in a meeting like this. So this will have to do as a kind of mock-up for a profit and loss account. And that's interesting too, because it doesn't say how much, how many goods, how much has been produced, how much benefit has actually been produced for society in the course of the year. It actually just says how much profit ultimately the company has actually made. So these things are kind of significant. It actually tells us something about the nature of the world in which we live. This relationship of wage labour to capital is very particular to capitalism, and because capitalism is quite a recent form of society, it's actually a very recent set of relationships. Capitalism only got going as a system around about 1820. There were capitalistic enterprises before that, but it only actually started to function as a system around about that time. Wage labour did, of course, exist in some previous societies, not all, but in some. However, the purpose of employing wage labour, that is, to accumulate capital, is quite new and quite distinct. It's quite particular to the capitalist system. Do you want to come and take a seat? And there are three features to this relationship: exploitation, profit, and conflict. Or three at least that I'm going to dwell on now. Exploitation is universal within capitalism. This relationship is an exploitative one in all respects. In different times and in different places it can be more or less exploitative, but it is always exploitative. And the reason for this is that the accumulation of capital in the hands of those who own capital is basically accumulated out of the unpaid labour of the people they employ. So it's the difference between what the employer pays the employee and the additional wealth that the employee creates for the employer. So it's ultimately and fundamentally an exploitative relationship. If it weren't, employers wouldn't employ people because it's the only way they can actually generate profit. So going on to profit, workers, people who work for a living, create goods for an employer for sale on the market. They don't create it for their own use. They don't create it even for their employer's use. They don't even create it for the good of society. The sole purpose of producing goods in capitalism is for sale on the market with a view to profit. This profit is appropriated by the owner of the business, and it's used, broadly speaking, I'm very much simplifying here, but it's used broadly speaking for two purposes. For his own purposes, for his own use, for his own fund his own lifestyle, and also for reinvestment in the company, which is important. And reinvestment is for the purpose of generating more profit, which is then used to generate more profit still. So we have this cycle within capitalism. It's wholly dedicated to the production of profit. It is not in any sense dedicated to the betterment of society. Profit is the main aim, and unfortunately for us, in our current condition, it creates wasteful activities. What it means is that, for example, you get heavy marketing of products which are harmful to human beings. I'm sure you can actually think of quite a lot of these yourself. I've actually chosen, because I've really read about it recently, I've actually chosen the tobacco industry. Now this is not a get out of any of you who happen to be smokers. I'm just interested here in the marketing, the way in which tobacco is actually marketed. Today in our world, it's pretty much regulated in the West, largely because we now know that the number of deaths from smoking-related illnesses a year comes to various estimates, but around about 5 billion a year in Britain for the cost of the national health, which is a cost to the government, a cost to the capitalist class as a whole, and therefore the individual industry is actually brought to book for this, and there is moderate regulation. It's only moderate because the government actually also gets a huge tax cut from it, so it's not as swinging as it might be. As a result, tobacco companies are now marketing to the developing world where there's much less regulation. I've found some really extraordinary statistics on this. They are marketing very heavily and primarily at children and young adults to get them addicted young. They are marketing it in terms of virility or contrary femininity, and in terms of excitement, which has nothing to do with real life and certainly has nothing to do with tobacco. And they are managing to achieve 80 to 100,000 new smokers every day. Okay? So the result of this is we expect 1 billion deaths to occur from smoking-related diseases in the 21st century. So here you see that the logic of capitalism is working totally against the logic of human need. Okay? The logic of capitalism and the logic of human need do not always, and in fact they don't often coincide. Okay, moving on, competition and conflict. The wage labour and capital relationship that I was talking about has a particular interesting result. It turns everyone into an isolated economic unit. I am one economic unit, Oliver here is another, Francesco, Steve, all individual economic units responsible for their own economic welfare. You might extend that to the family rather than the individual, and you can also extend it, since the development of joint stock companies, corporations, a business, a group of businessmen actually functioning within a business. But ultimately we are talking about lots of independent economic units. And the interests of each one of these economic units is different from every other. So within society, within capitalist society, you have a vast system of competition, and where you have competition, that very often will break out into open conflict. So capitalism, far from being a society which seeks to further human need, it's a society in a state of total warfare with itself. You get this conflict happening at all sorts of levels. You get it between workers and capitalists. You get it between workers and workers. You get it between capitalists and capitalists, between the state and the working class, between states, and between states and individual industries and businesses that they are responsible for. Let's have a look at some of these. Let's have a look at the conflicts, first of all, that occur between workers and capitalists. For every extra penny that an employer grants to a worker in his wage packet, it's a penny less in profit to himself. So there is a competition for the product of the social product which is generated by any individual business. So there's a tension built into the very root of this relationship. And of course, it, as so often happens in capitalism, the system is one person's gain is necessarily another person's loss. So that tension is always there. You get commercial competition between businesses, which means that there is a great deal of pressure on them to cut costs. One of the significant costs that may be cut is the cost of the wage packet. So there is always, over time, a downward pressure on wages. Now, workers resist this, naturally, and they're quite right to do so. It's quite necessary for them to maintain their living standards. So you get conflict, you get industrial action. From the workers' perspective, this is essential. From a social perspective, it's hugely wasteful, because this competition and conflict that is going on all the time could actually, all that energy could be put into much more productive activities for the development of human welfare. It's also traumatic as well. If any of you remember the miners' strike or any kind of major kind of industrial action over the last 30 years, you can remember how sort of traumatic that was for many people. The other thing that businesses need to do to maximise profit is to maximise productivity. And that means getting as much out of the workers for as little as possible. Workers, therefore, are treated as a resource. They are a human resource. They're quite open about it nowadays in terms of the nomenclature. Putting it another way, they're a milk cow for profit. So this has an effect on their daily working environment and their daily experience in the workplace. It's not a good experience for many, many people. The jobs are tedious very often. They're very often limited in scope. They give limited opportunity for people to take part in the social process. They're limited in terms of their creativity, and there's very little opportunity to develop the full potential very often for many people in the workplace. Some people love their work. I'm not kind of disputing that. But for many people, what I've actually noticed is that even people who say they love their work, come Friday, you say, how are you? They say, oh, it's really glad on Friday, I'm really glad the weekend's coming up. So, you know, it's not actually an integrated and valuable part for many people their work in their lives. There's conflict, of course, between worker and worker as well. This sets up these conflicts. There's competition between jobs and better paid jobs, between promotion and status, which leads to office politics, which leads to backbiting. We all know the kind of office environment or the workplace environment. Though, of course, it also leads to oppressive power relations and abuse of power. It breeds a hierarchical worldview. Now we come to the competition between the capitalist and capitalists. Now this is where we really start to get into some major stuff. Capitalists are in competition for market share. The fundamental relationship, as I said, divides us into individual economic units. It divides businesses into individual economic units. Each business strives to outperform its rivals. Okay? It must do this, because if it doesn't do this, the penalties are bankruptcy, buyout, and business failure. Okay? This also means a loss of privileged income for the owner of the business and status and everything that goes with it. A failure to generate an average profit is unattractive to investors. If a company is not generating enough profit, investors will not invest. They will take their capital elsewhere. Banks will also be less willing to lend, and starved of capital, the business will eventually go under. So remaining competitive in capitalist society is not a choice. It is a necessity forced upon the capitalist enterprise by the way in which the system, the competitive nature of the system itself. And to remain competitive, all kinds of socially useful or harmful practices are kind of engaged in. I've already mentioned the shoddy products to keep the cost down to try and undercut your competitors, planned obsolescence, restrictions on technological advance, and things with kind of real serious social consequences. I was reading not so long ago about the United Fruit Company in Central America, and one of their practices was to buy up huge tracts of land, not because they wanted them, but simply to prevent competitors buying them up. Land which was left fallow, which was left unused, which could have supported some impoverished peasant farmers who really were looking forward to it. So these are the kind of issues within capitalism where the logic of capitalism, again, militates against the logic of human needs. I mean, you get all things like companies sit on patents for years to prevent other people getting hold of them. So useful technological advances are actually repressed. All sorts of consequences follow from this competitive relationship between businesses. You get dangerous products produced, all sorts of things. Another way to reduce costs is to introduce labour-saving technology and to expand the business. And if your rival does that, you'll better do so likewise, because otherwise he's going to uncut you and he's going to start to drive you out of business. So there is a competition to expand within capitalism. It's a never-ending cycle of innovation and expansion. At the moment, where the trend is about 3% per year growth in the economy. To stand still in the marketplace is basically to fail or to be swallowed up by a bigger organisation. The result of this is chaotic, unplanned, and driven. Capitalism is not an organised society, it is an entirely anarchic one. Growth is not an individual decision. It's not a result by corporate executives. It's not a government policy. It's part of the anarchic logic of capitalism itself. People are driven to act in this way. They don't make choices. This, of course, renders businesses insensitive to the devastation they might be wreaking on the environment, to ruthless exploitation of unrenewable natural resources, and it creates damage to individuals. Very often, it also creates within businesses an attitude of go for profit. Okay? So what this means is that many businesses would rather break the law, which is sort of the kind of what limits there are on their activities, would rather break the law and pay the penalty than actually cut back on their activities. That happens all the time. We see that. It's the logic of the cost-benefit analysis is applied right across society within capitalism. And what this material logic doesn't actually accomplish through the competitive process, it's perfected by reflecting it into a business ethic and a legal code, because businesses are, of course, legally required to maximise their profits on behalf of their stockholders and shareholders. And of course it gets generalised to the rest of society. You just have to watch the TV or look at newspapers for daily examples of all this. I've got one example which kind of quite interests me. It's from pharmaceutical companies. What have you got?
A bit over time, actually.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. So, all right. So, I got through this much quicker at home. Sorry. I'll very quickly then wind up. I will forget that. The state, of course, just mentioned the state. The state, of course, has main functions are to provide a legal framework for capitalism, and of course competition here occurs as well between states. And of course this leads to the major event of the capitalist system, and that is major international wars. Competition is for all sorts of reasons. It's for to find trade routes for raw materials, resources, to get a strategic advantage for future, and so on and so forth. Just look at the Iraq War, for example. Whatever the causes of the Iraq War, you know that at some level resources were actually the oil that's actually in the region had something to do with it. And finally, and 100 million people are said to have died in the 20th century as a result of capitalism's wars. And the only other thing I mentioned very briefly is the trade cycle. Because of the anarchic nature of the marketplace, it gives rise to the trade cycle within capitalism, the boom and bust cycle, which is every 10 years we get a bust, and then we get sort of pick up, and roughly we get bust again. So we're going through one of the most major depressions at the time. The last one was the 1930s. Before that, the Great Depression before that was actually the 1880s. Before that, you've got the 1840s, the Hungry 40s as they were known. The constant cycle of boom and bust as a result of the anarchic nature of the marketplace within capitalism. So finally, it all comes down to one simple fact. All these features of capitalism come down to one simple source, and that is the social relations that actually exist and which define the system. There is actually only one problem, and that means there is only one solution. Thank you.
Thank you much, Dick, for that very interesting introduction. Now I'll hand you over to Francesco of the Zeitgeist Movement. We'll take about 20 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. The time I have.
Okay, about 20 minutes. Okay, after that, I'll open the floor to